Fantastic. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this conversation between Tsering Yangzom Lama and Shruti Swamy. We're welcoming both of these authors together for the release of Tsering's novel, We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies. I'm Cara Johnson, the events coordinator for Green Apple Books here in San Francisco, and we're delighted to be the San Francisco stop on the We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies tour. Small amount of business before we get to the main event. I would encourage you to check out our event calendar on our website at greenapplebooks.com/event. I'm a little biased, but I think that we do have a good collection of events coming up in the near future. So if you are interested in events such as tonight's, then you might be interested in something else that we have. And we always love seeing you there, either in person or virtually. So I would encourage you to check that out. All of our events are free unless stated otherwise. So that being said, if you are able, please do buy books. Please do buy books from these authors that are joining us for tonight. It not only supports us as an independent bookstore in putting on events such as these, but it also supports the authors who put so much work into making these books. And I can say for certainty that these are two books that you would really like to have. You won't regret purchasing them for yourself or a loved one. So I'm going to link to both Tsering and Shruti's books in the chat in a moment, and I would encourage you to check that out. And just a bit of run of show before we get started. And so we all know kind of what to expect. We're going to have some reading tonight, as well as a conversation between these two authors. And then we're going to have an audience Q&A at the end, and we'll get to as many questions as we can by the end of the hour. And if you have a question at any point in time during the hour, I would encourage you to enter them into the Q&A on the bottom of your screen. And again, we'll get to as many as we can. So thank you for joining us. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce both the authors joining us tonight. First, Shruti Swamy is the author of the story collection, A House is a Body, and the novel, The Archer, both from Algonquin Books. The winner of 2 O. Henry Awards, her work has appeared in the Paris Review, McSweeney's, and Afar magazine. She is the recipient of a creative writing fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as grants from the Elizabeth George Foundation, the San Francisco Arts Council, and Vassar College. She is a Kundiman Fellow and lives in San Francisco. Please welcome Shruti Swamy. Hey, and I forgot to mention that The Archer comes out in paperback in August, so keep an eye out for that. But welcome, Shruti. And last but most certainly not least, I'm delighted to introduce Tsering Yangzom Lama, who holds an MFA from Columbia University and a BA from the University of British Columbia in creative writing and international relations. She's received grants and residencies from the Canada Council for the Arts, Art Omi, Hedgebrook, Tin House, and the Barbara Deming Memorial Fund, among others. Tsering was born and raised in Nepal and has lived in Vancouver, Toronto, and New York City. And We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies is the reason that we are together this evening. So please join me in welcoming Tsering Yangzom Lama. Thanks, folks.
Oh, thank you so much, Car, for those introductions. Tsering, I wondered if you wanted to just start us off with a reading from your book, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Before I begin, I have to say thank you so much to Shruti for not only reading my book and giving me just the dreamiest blurb I could imagine, but also for agreeing to do this event. And also to Green Apple Books for hosting us in Car. So thank you so much. I am just going to read from about 179 pages into the novel. This is a section for a character named Tenki, who is the little sister of the 2 sisters who flee Tibet. And that's the novel essentially follows their lives over 50 years or so. And the context you need is that this is taking place in Toronto, Canada in 2012. And her inner monologue is directed toward her mother, who passed away when she was a child. And she mentions a saint statue called the Nameless Saint, which is a statue from Tibet that appears and disappears and passes through a bunch of characters' hands in the course of the novel. And the Nameless Saint is, the statue is something that she comes across as a child. So she mentions that statue. Tenki, Toronto, Canada, 2012. All my life, I have wanted to tell you this story, but a story must begin at the beginning, and I have almost nothing from the start of my life. Not your face, not Bala's. All I have is a few corners of our abandoned house. I erased the rest without intending to. I let them fall away by doing nothing. Instead, I am cursed with 1,000 memories I cannot reach. My sister must remember what you looked like, but Achalhamo never answers my questions about the past. If only I could open her mind like a jar, if I could just peer inside and see you once, how real you would become, how real you are struggling to become, even now, from the distance of 50 years. When I saw you last, you were leaving to gather firewood. In the final minutes of daylight, I watched your back slip away between the trees. With each blink, you grew fainter, until there was no shape that resembled you. Then it was morning, and Achalhamo said you had died in the night. Where, I asked, craning my neck to scan the snow-dusted riverbank, then searching for you in Acha's eyes. Gone, she said. I could hear nothing but river flowing down the mountains, along the banks we had followed for months. I told her she was wrong, that you were just picking up branches. Gone, Acha repeated, her eyes red and large. Gone beyond gone. So much had happened since that day. Dawn after dawn, your eyes did not see. Cities and hills your feet did not trace. My introduction to a thing called an ocean you never beheld. I want to show you all of it. I want to tell you about everything you've missed, of my life, what I've done, what has been done to me, your youngest, the camp's hope, the one no one speaks of anymore. Even if it is a broken story, I must have you know it. Just tell me that you can hear me. My eyes spring open in the dark. I am alone here. Even my niece is gone, her empty bed across the room from mine. Where has that girl gone? And what's this above the television? 2 thin, jagged lines stretch across the length of the wall. New cracks in this old house? I feel around for the plastic button, click it, and the lamp flashes on. The lines tremble. Hundreds of ants are making a long passage from the bathroom to the kitchen and back. 2 delicate threads in motion. Could this be the most important thing happening in Parkdale? The alarm clicks on and starts beeping at its usual hour, telling me to prepare for my shift. I reach for my phone while waiting for my eyes to adjust. There's a message from Doma. Read the message, I tell myself. Stay present for her. She is beginning to look at you like the others do. I need to speak to you, she wrote at 2 a.m. Be home soon. Pushing off the layers of blankets, I prop myself up and dig my toes into the rough carpet, which is thin enough that I can feel the cold cement foundation underneath. It's nearly the end of the semester. Maybe Doma's school marks have come through. She is a lucky girl going to university in this country, in this calm city with its rules and opportunities laid out like its roads, in straight, bright lines for all to see. Yes, she must be doing well in school. Yet I know my niece. She would not message me about her grades. She would only tell me about them if I asked, after much prodding and insisting. In fact, I sense she hides the world of her education, as though I would be somehow ashamed or saddened to hear about the books she reads and the classes she attends. Perhaps she thinks that I'll be reminded of the life I once had, that upon hearing of her studies, I will view my current work as lowly and demeaning by comparison. No, I want to tell her, I am the one who pays the rent, who keeps you safe. And so my work, whether I'm cleaning rooms or picking through recycling bins, does what any job should do. It makes other lives possible. With each bed I dress, each towel I fold, I make possible our life and your mother's and Po Mingmar's. And do you also not realize that each morning when you go to the university and every night when you return with your bags stretched by books, your mind alive and searching, that you make my life possible? But my niece does not understand this. A number of other possibilities come to mind, each as absurd as the next. She wants to tell me about a boyfriend, perhaps someone she has kept secret from her family until now. She wants me to meet him, which means she wants me to know her more fully. Or she wants to go for a holiday to Niagara Falls the way I've always suggested, just the 2 of us standing amid the mist, sleeping at a beautiful hotel overlooking the falls. Or another possibility, this is about the saint, or whatever statue she thinks is the nameless saint. The meeting with the former minister will not have satisfied her, and I sense that she will now want to raise the issue with the exile government. I know this because I know the mind of a young woman with intelligence and dreams. Okay, I type, see you. In the bathroom, the faucet handle squeaks as it opens, and the pipes clang as if beaten by a man trapped inside. A quickly warming river runs through my fingers. Here I can slowly wake from my dream. I can linger among the trees, the faint moon at dawn, the thin dusting of snow. There's always water between my ears, but this is the past. This is not now. Another bad night of little sleep, and my body is getting restless again. What of the nameless saint, though? When I first saw him, he was floating high above me in Amma's fingers, with a strange light dancing on his polished body that was sparsely covered in gold pigment. I stared at the lotus petals rising from the statue's base, the fine ridges on his ribs, arms, and knees. Even though I was feverish, I realized that the light upon his form did not come from the tense mouth. Rather, the saint was lit from within. I looked around and saw that all of us inside these walls were awash in his luminescence. Everyone's faces seemed different, their skin sparkling like sand in the sun, their eyes glimmering like stars. It was as though the ancient moon were passing through our tent. Amma told us that the nameless saint statue came and went, appeared and disappeared, as if by his own will, to visit those who needed him. Through our tears, we smiled in gratitude and relief. We realized then that all along, Amma had been right. Every step she chose, each turn we took, all of it had brought us to the saint. Then I thought of my father, still unable to walk, and his feet, which I was not allowed to see. I closed my eyes, exhausted by the colossal waves of sorrow, and let my head drop, swinging here and there. My sister clutched me from behind and helped me down. Amma knelt before me, and I watched as she lowered the base of the saint slowly until its rough surface tapped my temple, breastbone, and spine. My skin vibrated in those 3 points. A calm spread through me, and I lost consciousness. I must have been gone for a long time because when I opened my eyes, the tent was quiet and dark. The only person around was Pala, asleep under a pile of sheepskin. Did I dream of the saint? Could my mind conjure such a fantasy? I looked at my hands and my arms, which did not sparkle. I looked at the tent's black walls, which were wearing thin and likely to tear again from the terrible winds of this bleak land. The moon was not inside our tent, and Pala's face was bloodless and loose on his bones, his expression weary even in sleep. Then my eyes glimpsed a dark object. It was a saint statue, except now it was dull and lifeless, blending in with our ordinary belongings. Now it was just a statue of a little man made of earth. Even the flecks of gold that remained on his ribs and stomach did not seem so bright. After that, I waited to see the nameless saint illuminated again, shining from within. In secret prayers, I begged him to show himself, to make me and my surrounded glow as only he could. Even in my nightmares, I spoke to him over and over, but I didn't know the truth until much later. What dulled the saint's light was not the land, but me. My mind is darkness. My mind eats light.
Thank you so much for that beautiful reading, Tsering. Wow, I'm so excited to talk to you today. It's so wonderful to see you. I read this book for the first time. I heard you read from this book, and when we were in Hedgerock together in 2018, and it was such a vivid reading that throughout the time, I've thought about it ever since, and being able to read this book and see it in the world is I think truly a privilege to be able to have seen it come into publication, and now it's in the world. So congratulations. I'm so excited for everybody to be able to finally get to read this beautiful book. I wanted to start out by asking, I just wanted to start at the beginning. I think I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about where this novel started for you. And I was particularly curious about the motif of the nameless saint. So I'm so glad that was so central to the passage you read. I just wanted you to talk about where there's so many threads in this novel. This is actually in some ways a really epic novel. It's spanning continents, it's spanning generations. And yet this motif really kind of pulls all of those threads of time and place together. So could you talk to us a little bit about where this book started for you, and particularly where the nameless saint started to become a central theme?
Sure, yeah. So I started writing this book in my MFA program at Columbia, and I was living in New York City. And I was also taking a lot of extra classes because they have a really good Tibetan studies program at Columbia. And, you don't get to do that very often in the West. So I took a Tibetan studies course. I took several of them. And one of them was focusing on Tibetan women. And so that led me to be interested in Tibetan women oracles, which is a long tradition, as old as the Greek oracles, really, and predates Buddhism's arrival in Tibet 1,200 years ago. It's very old, and women have had a huge role in it, and it's a very, very rich, interesting space, especially for Western and Central Tibet, where my family's from. And to me, I was fascinated by the idea of women having power in their villages in this very specific way. So I really got interested in studying that and the lives and stories of women Buddhist practitioners and how they found spaces of independence and liberation and freedom in a patriarchal society, like how they pushed to be scholars and practitioners of like metaphysics. So I was very interested in that. I was doing that kind of study. I didn't really know that I was going to write about it in my novel, but I was writing a novel simultaneously and taking these courses. And then another course I took in art history led me to, visit a bunch of museums. And I went to the Rubin Museum, which is a Himalayan museum in New York City, and they have, an incredible collection of Tibetan work. And there was a little statue there, actually, that inspired me to write about it. The statue is part of their permanent collection, and it's a little mudman statue about this big. And it was described as just being a 15th century Mahasiddha, which is a kind of a saint. And there's like 70 something Mahasiddhas, but they didn't know the name. So there was no name, and they didn't know the origin, but they knew it was Tibetan. And I was fascinated by the statue because from one side, when you look at the statue, it looks like it's in a lot of pain. It looks like a saint in a lot of pain. And from another side, it looks like the saint is in a moment of just like exaltation and just pure joyful enlightenment almost. And it was a very enigmatic statue for me because it doesn't resemble any other statue I've ever seen in the Buddhist pantheon, which tend to have like a Buddha's face, which is very like peaceful and enlightened and kind and compassionate, but almost like it's just displaying a quality that you want to emulate. Like it's displaying a quality of like being rising above the muddy conditions or the muddy existence of being a human being. And when practitioners meditate before that kind of statue, they want to bring out those qualities in themselves. It's an aspirational tool of meditation, those kinds of statues. Or you have like Yamantaka, which is the Lord of Death, and it has a fierceful, wrathful stare that's meant to like cut through your ignorance. And that's also a different, like a common expression. But this one was completely enigmatic, unlike anything I'd seen. And on top of that, there was no story. And I saw it in this like, secular space in the West. And I see you smiling because like, you know what this is like, and these works, we don't know how they got there, but we certainly know that there has been a lot of looting in Tibet, just like many other parts of the world. In the 1900s, there was looting by the British, and then there's been far more looting by the Chinese, and even Tibetan people have been part of this looting of smuggling out goods from Tibet, precious objects, and disseminating them around the world. So I was very fascinated by the statue. I was really interested in the oracular tradition. And then I knew I wanted to write about this experience of Tibetan refugee exiles, because that's been the experience that I've grown up in. So it took me a long time to find the story, but those elements all kind of came about at the same time, about 12 years ago.
Oh, that's so beautiful and so rich. I was also just thinking about how that saint, it's not only that expression is enigmatic, but it's something that you write about so beautifully in the book, that it's made out of ordinary earth, like the earth of this homeland, this lost homeland. And it's like, sometimes it has like a transcendent quality to it. And then sometimes it's like, characters are looking at it, even in the passage you read, and saying, oh, this looks like kind of ordinary, right? It's like the power and there's so many it symbolizes so beautifully so many ways of looking and seeing this culture, both as an insider and as an outsider. So yeah, I wonder if you just want to talk a little bit briefly. Some people watching might not have read the book yet. So if you just want to briefly summarize the plot so that we can start using some familiarity with the elements, that just really quickly, that would be really helpful.
Sure. So basically it starts in the late 50s when the Chinese invasion is really intensifying. That invasion took about a decade. And there's a family of two sisters, Tenki and Lamo, and their mother is a village oracle, and she guides their village into exile. She finds the path that they will take to escape, and that actually happened for the Dalai Lama. He had an oracle, but that was a state oracle, and that's often the story that gets told, at least among Tibetans, and also movies like Gundung that Scorsese made about the historical moment is told through that oracle. But also we had lots of female oracles, and so I wanted to recast that whole story through women and put women at the center and far away from the centers of power. So they flee, and the parents both die in the difficult journey over the Himalayas. And then the two sisters are orphans, and they're taken care of by their uncle. And they eventually find their way to a refugee camp that they build with other refugees in Nepal. And then essentially their lives fork. Tenki is the section that I read. She's sort of seen as the brilliant one. She's the younger one. She's the hope of the camp. And Lamo is she takes the role of the caretaker. And that leaves their lives in very different ways, because Tenki gets an education. She goes to India. She eventually goes to Canada, and Lamo doesn't. She remains in the camp. And then we hear from other characters as well, Lamo's daughter, this guy named Samfel, who trades in antiques. He takes antiques from Tibet and sells them to make a living. So essentially it's the story of 50 years of a family's existence through exile and fracture, essentially. And and then the nameless saint is a statue that passes through all of their hands.
Wonderful. Yeah. So this story, Tenki winds up in Canada, and so does Lamo's daughter, Dolma. And I was curious about the choice. Like it's a huge scope, really, where we travel through lots of different settings, and particularly this world. Like Canada is a really big part of, like it's a big player in this story, and this idea of like maybe even double displacement, right, where they're even out of their familiar environment of the refugee camp, and now that they're trying to make their way in a totally foreign culture. So I was curious why, what if you want to talk a little bit about the choice of widening the scope, not just to the generation who experience this trauma of displacement directly, but to move on to the next generation and even into another culture to look at that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a lot of things changed very quickly for Tibetans in the last 50 years. So like within 50 years, like people went, like my grandparents were nomads, like their great, like it's thousands of years of nomads. And then suddenly my parents were like refugees, essentially penniless, begging for food on the side of the road, making toys to make a living. And then I lived in the West. I've lived in Nepal, and was pursuing to become, some sort of a writer or something. Had dreams to be a writer. And I was struck by the fact that this is actually an incredible amount of change that pretty much all Tibetans in exile have experienced, to greater or less privilege than I have. And I felt that what was really interesting here was the disorientation or the changes across generations, and how staggering our fates, like the winding path our fates have taken. And I was also really interested, I think like a lot of exiles, there's this focus on that original expulsion, like that moment of rupture from the land and from the home. And that is still a very real story for Tibetans, and a very recent one. So for me, I wanted to begin at that moment when a nation was lost, and then tell the story of one family, just to like narrow it down a little bit, but to tell that that decades long story of what's happened since then and how they survived, and just how complicated it is to experience so much change in just a few decades, like tremendous change to go from nomads or farmers to, immigrants and refugees all over the world.
Right, absolutely. And the way you write about Tibet, so we are in Tibet at the very beginning of the book, but we don't spend very much time there except in memory and aching memory. Like the way that Tibet is rendered in this book is like truly one of the achievements of it, because it is just incredibly immediate, sensory, and felt so beautifully by the characters. And I was wondering actually if you would mind reading that passage I told you that I wanted you to read right now in the context of this question.
Yes, for sure. So this is also again in Tenki's section. And she's thinking about the moment when they left, and okay. This was magic. Long ago, our world was full of enchantment. When Amma was alive, when we roamed our pastures and lived beside lakes and mountains filled with gods. Then we crossed over the mountains and magic snagged on the ridges. It slipped off our bodies and we lost our beauty.
Oh, thank you, God. Gets me every time I read it or experience it. Yeah, I think what's so striking about that passage, or does something really elegantly that your book is doing, like every time you're visiting this idea of Tibet, it's an idea, it's a thing that is longed for, it is a real place, it is a place imbued with centuries of meaning, it is the source of, it is the anchor for these characters, it's the way that they make sense of themselves, it is their spirituality, is all the gods live in this land that they are being expelled from. And it is something felt physically. Your book is called We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies. That refers to an act of prayer, which the person lies down on the ground and then gets up, like kind of circumnavigates a space by lying down and standing up, and walking that way, literally putting their bodies onto this earth, worshiping the earth with their bodies. So an intense physical and sensory connection to this land that is lost. And I sort of have like 17 questions and like no questions. I like sort of wanted to say that and ask, like, what were you thinking about? It's incredibly technically challenging to write like this, because what you're doing is you're writing a real place and a memory of a place. You're writing a place as culture. You're writing a place as like physical, like connection. Can you just talk about how you approached rendering Tibet so beautifully in your book?
Thank you, Shruti. That's very kind. Well, first of all, I had a lot of resistance to placing any of the book in Tibet, and
that makes a lot of sense. It's like a big, it's a huge task. Yeah.
Exactly. And as a Tibetan in exile, it's actually not possible for me to go there. Like I can't get a visa. So this is not something that, this is a historical novel, but I'm not able to access all the historical research I want to do because I can't physically go there and I don't have access to, living in the West, it's not like, writing a history of the Civil War, like where I can literally go and catch like, entire libraries full of stuff. So I had a lot of work to do to get over my own resistance and my own fear of writing about Tibet. But I did go on a trek to the border around the same time as I was taking these courses, and I was, beginning something. It all happening at the same time. And it took many, many years for it to sort of take shape. But I did go to the border of Tibet and Nepal. It was a 7-day trek, maybe 8 days. And in Mustang, which is an ancient kingdom, basically a Tibetan area as well, but now is in Nepal. And I, rented a car, and for the last part, because it was quite dangerous, you're not supposed to go to the border. And they have a lot of Chinese guards there. And we rented this car and we drove up the plateau. And I remember it's a very dramatic rise. And up until then, I had been walking basically in this like desert mountain landscape for days. And this was the path that a lot of Tibetans took into exile. So I really knew I needed to experience this landscape. I didn't exactly know what I was going to do with it, but I knew I needed to experience it. And so I'd had all of these experiences and seeing all of these important landscapes and seeing how the people were, you know, all very Tibetan-esque, but, you know, this is a border area. And so, so we were driving up in this four-wheeler and driving up the plateau, and it's a very dramatic rise. And you can really feel that you're going up onto another landscape. And all of a sudden, you know, you see a new range of mountains, the sky becomes intensely blue, and there's just this huge expanse of land. And what was beautiful was actually when I reached the top of the plateau, this white horse came from nowhere, which I can't even explain, which is very symbolic for Tibetan Buddhists, like white horses. And like this white horse came and like was in front of our Jeep and was like leading us toward the border. It was crazy. And then after a while, the white horse went away, and I have a photo of this white horse. Otherwise, I would believe that I had just made it up, but it just came out of nowhere and it disappeared. Anyways, and then we were at the border, and I spent about 15 minutes there because there was a wire fence, and then there was a Chinese encampment, and they told us you have 15 minutes before they're going to come over and they're going to start asking questions. And so that was a very important moment for me, because I was like, okay, I've experienced this very vividly. I know I can write this. I didn't know at the time that I could write it, but I knew I would eventually write it. And so the book, you know, it's from the moment of expulsion. Hamo, the girl who's narrates the beginning, she's a child of war. So this was strategic too, okay? Because it's a child. That's helpful. It's very hard for me to access like an adult's understanding of Tibet. So, you know, that's my little trick, I guess. You know, a child is going to remember a homeland very differently from an adult, especially if they've been through years of strife and an occupation that's slowly building. And she has already left Tibet, left her home, but she's in the border area, and she's like walking towards the border with her family. So that, I guess I gave myself these little things that I could deal with as a writer. And it still took me many years to deal with that. But I think also I really had to work on world building as a writer, like if we're talking craft. I think that's often a difficult thing for writers to do. And at a certain point, I decided I was going to do much more world building, much more scene setting, much more description than I was doing. And then I pulled back. So I think that's always like going to be my new trick going forward. It's like write much more than I think, describe everything I can possibly describe, and then like pare it back. And, you know, also in order to describe any of the landscapes that I describe, I really had to do a lot of research. I had to find photos. I had to find records of aid agencies, reports about the camps, because a lot of that stuff, there wasn't a ton of information about. And it's really a difficult thing to ask family members to relive. So I had little bits of information from them, but a lot of it was based off of research.
I was going to ask you about your research process, because this book feels very meticulously researched and very well realized, but I wonder if you've already said what you wanted to say about it. I was just struck by what you were saying about just not being able to actually, like legally not being able to experience this place and going anyway. I mean, that this book in some ways is an act of reclamation, right? Mm-hmm. That you're like, no matter what, you can bar me from this place, but you can't actually, like, I'll experience it in my mind and in my imagination, and I will render it for people. And that's mm-hmm. such a beautiful part of writing this book, is being like, this is mine, I claim it. Mm-hmm. And I just, Yeah, I'm just thinking about freedom. I'm thinking about like the ways that these characters are so constrained by their circumstances, are yearning to be able to do things that they're not allowed to do, whether it's like return to their homeland, to pursue certain opportunities. I just wondered, this is a very general question, and if it's too general, I can give you like a little bit more specificity, but I wondered if you just had any thoughts about freedom in this book, like especially for your women characters, which you mentioned a little earlier, and in the context of women oracles.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that is actually one of the main themes of the book is how women find ways to express or access their agency, in small ways or in moments of intimacy with other women. Also, like Lamo is a character that doesn't get to be educated because of her circumstances in life. She grows up in a camp and she needs to earn money, and she longs for independence. She longs to be free on her own terms, and she can't because she's got her uncle who's sort of runs her life, and then she's got to get married because that's the next male person that runs her life. But she has this dream, and she eventually does find a freedom of her own of some kind. And I think that that's been something that I've noticed a lot among Tibetan women in exile that I've known. Is like there is freedom, and that freedom is quietly expressed sometimes, or it comes later in life sometimes. If they're coming in from a working class background, let's say. If you're more privileged, then that's different. Like I've experienced much more privilege and therefore much more freedom. So this book is also about class, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, and how class determines everything. But I also think that like there's so much silence in this book, and that silence in terms of what the characters will say to each other can sometimes be looked at as like a trauma thing, but also I think it's also an expression of agency as well, and it's an expression of freedom. When we demand an answer from another person, that's often in a very like an unequal setting or an unequal sort of projection of our relation to another person. But people who are equals accept silence from each other, accept the freedom to say or not say, the freedom to fulfill or not fulfill the other's expectations, or give access or not give access to their inner lives. And I think that's a way in which my book's structure is also meant to convey that freedom. Like, in a sense, the characters are fractured, but they also, like Lamo has the freedom to not subject her daughter to these memories. And that's also her power and her agency. So I want to see everything from multiple perspectives. I think that's the beauty of a novel. Like you can have multiple perspectives in a novel. It's not an essay. It's not my position.
Right.
One voice. It's like, I want to throw all kinds of people's ideas and ways of moving through the world and seeing the world and expressing what they believe to be, how they should live and how they want to be.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that you brought up silences, because there are so many powerful silences, particularly between mothers and daughters. I think this is a book about motherhood and daughterhood in lots of ways. I mean, we see Amma with Lamo and Tanki when they're very small. They lose her very young. So she's already an absent figure. And then Lamo and her relationship with Dolma, filled with also lots of silences, filled with a lot of distance. And I think that in some ways, because Dolma is staying with Tanki when she comes to Canada, there's sort of like a mother-ish, they're also working through kind of a mother-daughter relationship there too. So these are women who have in some ways not really been mothered, and have also, as daughters, as women, had to fulfill a lot of roles and responsibilities. And I'm just curious if you wanted to talk a little bit about this. These are central. This motherhood is so central, and daughterhood so central in this book. So can you talk to me about why that felt so important for you to discuss in this, or to look at and examine, turn around in this context?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, as I said earlier, like on some high level, theoretical level, I really wanted to recast this modern history of Tibet through women and put women at the center and tell this whole thing pretty much through women. And so that was a big part of it. I knew this was going to be a women heavy book. Because that's the world in which I have lived in, and I find women to be very interesting. I know you write a lot about women as well, and mother-daughter relationships. I think it's incredibly complex. There's so much ambiguity. There's so much, there's also like mystery wrapped in fear and longing, and then the ways in which like women's roles, as they change, they get to re-experience, their mothers and all of that. And the book is really structured around relationships. So it's structured around daughters, sisters, lovers, self. And in each section, except for the final one, we go between two characters, because I really think that, identity to me is relational, and that's how identity is formed and expressed in these very specific relationships, and what those roles demand of us, or what they bring out of us in our responsibility towards each other. And I think that Tibetan women, from what I've seen, have really held our community together. And I think that that's a story that hasn't been told that much, because the focus has been so much on the national narrative of struggle, of liberation, and survival, understandably. But I'm very interested in people. I'm interested in families. I'm interested in women. And to me, that is the day-to-day lived experience. That's how actually we have survived, is these relationships and women specifically.
That's so beautiful. And I actually want to come back to that, because that it connects really nicely to another one of my questions. But before I get to that, I wanted to ask you, lost it. I looked at it. Oh, so so much of this book is about putting language into around experiences that sort of defy language. And in some ways, those are there's some very powerful writing about people, these characters experiencing their spirituality. They're things that are very sacred and almost unspeakably sacred, that you are not that it's not that it's not allowed to put them into language, but rather that they're experiences that exist beyond language. And likewise, you're writing about a kind of incredible, large scale political violence, an incredible national trauma, right? That is also these experiences of exile, both the holy and the violent and the traumatic exist sort of outside of language, which is a really hard thing to write a book about. I'm so curious if you wanted to talk about the choices you were making or what you were thinking about. I think it's also, I know that you must have been really making a lot of really deliberate choices around how you talked about this violence that these characters face. And so anything that brings up for you, I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, I definitely had to engage with the sacred for this book, because it would have been so central for my characters, first of all, but also because I don't think you could really understand what this moment has meant, the expulsion, the land dispossession, what that dispossession has meant outside of a spiritual framework. Because I think that's, for Tibetans, we believe that land is sacred. We believe that it's occupied by spirits, like the rivers have, river spirits, and the mountains have mountain gods, and oracles are vessels to speak with and consult and receive advice from these deities that live in the land. And that's why Tibetans in Tibet, when they can, they oppose, Chinese state mining projects so vehemently, to which they will face, imprisonment for years, if not death, because that violence on that land is not something that can be understood through purely material frameworks, rational frameworks, so-called rational frameworks. And that to me is a big part of the story. It's about different worldviews as expressed through empire, as expressed through imperialism, colonialism, occupation. But that those are also, worldviews that essentially are being, that they're facing each other. And unfortunately for Tibetans, our worldview has not really survived very well in Tibet, although it is, people are definitely struggling to keep it going. And then in exile, there's a double layer of violence as well, an additional layer of violence. I mean, in that now to survive in a country or countries where you're far away from those gods, but also that past worldview doesn't really have a place, right? So like growing up in Nepal, I had to, like so many Tibetans in Nepal, we speak multiple languages because we have to survive in multiple contexts. You're constantly code switching, and this is not unique for any immigrant. This is a typical thing. But then you have to also switch belief systems, worldviews. I had students at yeshiva college, Orthodox students, and in the morning they would go to Talmudic studies and they're engaging with these texts, the Torah and all that. And then they come into my class, it's a secular class, and then they can no longer justify their arguments by talking about, their rabbinical studies. It's like that, right? But I do think that the sublime and the sacred is the source of immense strength, as well as loss. That loss can only be understood that, but it's also perhaps the reason why Tibetans and so many people who have been enslaved, marginalized, have survived is through our faith, our music, our arts, our culture that becomes the vessel or the space of community, collective power, and identity formation, and all of these things that in those spaces, the arts and the spiritual, the ineffable, the valueless, I guess, in an outside perspective, that becomes like the essence of the greatest value and strength.
Yeah, that's so that's so beautiful. And I'm just thinking about I'm thinking about the word resilience. I think this is a really heavy book in some ways because you're exploring a really painful history, and that is it's ongoing. What's this situation? And there's a lot of loss, very, very painful, but these are characters who are incredibly resilient. And I wanted to talk about that because I think that there is so much hope in the resilience of these characters. And one of the sources of resilience, you've already kind of touched on this, but I just wanted to talk about it a little bit more. I think hearing you talk about the idea of code switching, not just language. I love this is sort of mind-blowing for me, not just language, but basically belief systems. That's actually, I think that I can really relate to that as a child of immigrants too. And I have often thought about my experiences of assimilation, which I'm not comparing to anybody's in this book or yours, but just this idea of tremendous loss and what you have to let go, but then also kind of a wiliness where you're able the flexibility of thought, right? That comes from being able to be okay, this is what I believe. This is what I grew up. This is what this culture believes. And instead of those things canceling each other out, those things laying on top of each other, that your world becomes so layered in meaning. So I was curious if you wanted to talk a little bit more about the resilience of your characters in this book, the source of this resilience in any ways that you haven't touched on, or why that felt important for you to include also.
I think, that there's been so much amazing writing and thought on this from like African American writers and thinkers, around double consciousness and all of this. But like this idea that, the master is the blindest person in the room, that they have the least amount of understanding, not only of, their condition, but of the people that they're supposed to have mastery over. They think they understand them, but they don't. And the people that are subjected to humiliation or subjugation or whatever, they understand the thing very clearly, and they can hold both the master's perspective and their own. And I think that is going back to what you were saying earlier about the violence, but also the sort of sublime elements in this, whereas like the day-to-day existence of many refugees, including many Tibetans, it's not a beautiful thing. Many Tibetans live in poverty, statelessness. It's a very difficult existence. Or if they live in Tibet, they have, incredibly difficult time. But the understanding that Tibetans have, also the access to this moral position or this moral view of what's right, and this being like an overwhelmingly peaceful movement struggle. I think that speaks to the depth and the beauty and the richness of the perspective of the oppressed. I think there's a lot that people who are supposedly in power can learn from people who are not in power. And that is something that I think is very hard to convince people of. I feel like I could say these things, but everybody's like, yeah. But I do think that there's a ton of resilience, and just like even on a simple level, I'm so amazed at like Tibetan refugees in Nepal, for instance, like people that I grew up around who, had very little formal education, but speak 4 to 6 languages because like that's what they had to do to survive, like.
Right. Or even like, I forgot to say this in my question, but like that even in the passage you read, like there's so much, these characters are so adaptable. They like have to start from scratch, right? And they make lives, they make livelihoods, they learn new skills, and they take great pride. Tenki takes great pride in the passage that you mentioned, where she's like, you think that this is demeaning? I'm putting food on the table. So there's great meaning too, just in the way that like they can take on these different roles, these different skills. Yeah, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that this is the place where I'm hoping that like I don't want to sort of confirm typical narratives, I guess, about this community or communities like this, that they come to the West and they it's like everything's great and they, all their dreams come true, but also that like they aren't hopeless. They always have pride and intelligence and dreams for themselves in whatever situation they're in, and more than anything, they take care of each other, which I think is incredibly noble. Right.
I had this thought where it's like they've lost their home, and that this incredible anchor of their lives that orients them completely to their world and their culture and their, just every facet of their lives. And they make homes of each other, that the relationships between people and the ways that they share these cultural touchstones, but just their love for each other becomes that homeland for them as they're in exile. And that is true, like a really, like a tremendous source of hope. It's a hopeful novel in that way. I don't see any questions. Does anybody have any questions? You should ask them right now, because I'm going to just keep asking questions. Otherwise, I think I'm going to ask you one more question and then we'll see where we're at. You mentioned wanting to upend like expectations or kind of maybe answer back or rewrite. depictions earlier, less complicated depictions of Tibet and Tibetan people. And I was curious, this is a book that is really like singular. I mean, I know there's many Tibetan writers here and abroad who are writing about their culture, but not a lot of that is surfacing to like mainstream American culture. And this is a major representation of Tibet, of Tibetan culture and Tibetan people, which I'm sure you had so much that felt like you felt that deeply, right? That I just wanted to talk about representation, maybe if you were thinking about audience, but I think there's also like, right, you knew that you were writing this book in English. You were going to be writing for like a Western audience who was coming in with certain expectations and also certain ignorance about what you were writing about. You know that you're also writing for your people, right? You know that you're writing for the people in your community, and that these people will be reading your work with great interest and hope to see their stories represented. So that's a lot of burden. It's a lot of responsibility to be managing while you're writing. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about like both, I mean, in both ways, right? The Western gaze and also the gaze of your own community. I don't know about your community, but I feel like my community has a lot of opinions about, and like even rules about what we can write about. Like we're not supposed to write about mangoes or whatever, there's like lots of expectations on the other end too. So and then in the middle, you're trying to tell a story. You're trying to tell a human story that is rich and complicated, real and true. And your allegiance is ultimately to the story, right? So just if you wanted to talk any direction about representation.
Yeah, for sure. It was definitely heavy on my mind throughout the entire process. Even if I tried not to think about it, just I think practically speaking, like these are tensions that pretty much all writers of like BIPOC backgrounds probably have to think about, and yes, for Tibetans, I think, because there aren't too many novels published in the West in English by Tibetans. This was an additional thing. I definitely wrote about some things that are kind of taboo in my community, not like explicit rules, but, I'm writing about, alcoholism and antiques theft and mental health issues, abuse. These are not things that we typically talk about because of our marginal reality. We're always guests in other people's countries, so we're always trying to be, okay, like trying to stay. And that being a stateless community, that there's an additional layer of pressure around being a model minority. But I'm not here to be anybody's mouthpiece. I'm not here to present a definitive anything. So I have to do what all the writers that I admire have done. And, as I'm writing, I'm thinking about writers like Katseya, who writes very explicitly about land dispossession and colonialism and racism and all these things. That's the tradition I'm thinking about. I'm thinking a lot about, Anglophone writers that I admire, and that's the tradition I'm working in. At the same time, I am trying to shake up like the Western world's often fetishistic portrayals of Tibetans, and that's been happening for centuries, in which Tibetans are silent beasts of burden who, facilitate the enlightenment of Westerners. We're the sidekicks, and we don't suffer, we don't feel pain. We're just happy Buddhists. And that's extremely problematic, especially when we are truly suffering. Like truly suffering. And so it's just like that had to be a challenge for me, and I could not be writing this without that in my mind. So I'm out here like, coming for everybody. Basically, so like in the novel, I'm critiquing Westerners, as well, and I'm critiquing, our occupiers. I'm critiquing certain inclinations in my community as well. And for me, the ultimate metric or the ultimate compass for me is to write honestly and to write, from my perspective, and to be as true to the things that I want to explore as possible. So that's basically all I tried to do. And we'll see how it goes. so far it's been good.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Positive.
Well, in terms of like artistic achievement, I think it went really well. But yeah, I think it's almost like, oh, what are you guys going to think about this?
Yeah.
Okay, we have one question in the chat, and then I think unfortunately, I actually have several more questions, but I think we'll just ask this question in the chat, and then maybe we will say goodnight. So Meredith is saying, claims this isn't really a question, but it does seem like a question. This isn't really a question, but I would love to hear you say more of the names in the book and learn how you picked them. And she also said she's a big fan of both of us. And thank you for being here.
Oh,
Thanks,
Meredith. The names in the book, well, Hamo is the daughter of the oracle, and actually Hamo actually means a female oracle. And that's a typical name we call female village oracles or female oracles is Hamo, or that's another word for the goddess as well. Tenki, honestly, I don't think that they're that interesting names. Like I just chose names that I could for me that felt seemed plausible. And then once they were there, they stuck. At some point I had to change some names because I gave them names of my cousins and stuff. And I was like, I don't think they
could do that too.
Yeah. But certain names I was like, this is the name. It makes sense to me. It was actually very intuitive. Yeah. I changed the name of the camp, the refugee camp. Initially, I used the real name of the refugee camp that I was thinking of. But for security reasons, I decided to change it. I think that will, but people, actually, I've met people from that camp who read my novel and they recognized it right away. And so, Tibetans might know it. But yeah, Nepal, there's still a lot of pressure on Tibetan refugees in Nepal, just because of how much influence the Chinese government has there. And so it's very hard for Tibetans there to do public gatherings, to do protests, to do, a lot of things. So that was something I changed. And yeah, the rest of it was just whatever name came to mind.
Well, Dolma that's kind of like a mispronunciation of her actual name, yes. Right? That she winds up just keeping because it's easier.
Yeah, I mean the anglicization of ethnic names is like it's like a common experience.
Yeah,
for most people from that background. But the way in which people of the past would just accept that and perhaps continue to accept that is something that I found interesting, and I wanted to. Even Doma is quite an easy name, and still.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, Tsering is a much harder name, and I've had it pronounced 17 different ways, and I don't care anymore.
Me too. Yeah. It's fine. Yeah, I get what you mean. Don't worry about it too much. Yeah,
it's all good. We have other battles to,
Yeah. Okay, well, we're right at the hour here. We're a little bit past, so I guess that we'll just say goodnight now. If Kar wants to come back and say a few words, I will first say, Tsering, thank you so much for this beautiful, what a wonderful, these answers are so wonderful, and this book is so wonderful. If you haven't read it, please read it right now. I read I have really bad insomnia, and I just, there was one night where I just was like, fine, I'm just going to keep reading this book since I can't sleep, and it was 4 a.m, and I was reading the end of this book, which is truly one of the most stunning. I didn't ask you any questions about it because I don't want to give anything away, but honestly, one of the most stunning endings of a book that I have ever read. So it's worth it to get all the way to the end. It's an incredible
I wrote that final scene in one sitting. I will say I've never done that before. But sorry.
No, don't say sorry. I also think listening to Tsering talk about her experience going to the border of Tibet, that will be an extra layer of appreciation that you'll have when you get to the end of this book. So anyways, thank you so much, Tsering, for this beautiful book and for your words tonight. And thank you so much, Green Apple, for having us.
I won't add too much. I'll let your words kind of hang in the air for all of us here, but I will just share my total gratitude to you both for being here and joining us, and for your insight and generosity. And it's a really lovely conversation, and I'm really glad to have been able to hear it. I'm really grateful to you, Tsering, for writing such a beautiful novel and sharing it with us here. And to you, Shruti, for all of your really great questions and deep reading that we get to experience too. And to all of you out there on the internet that got to join us, thank you so much. I have the link to both Tsering and Shruti's books in the chat. I would encourage you to check them out.
Please check out Shruti's book. The Archer is, I'm telling you, like, Shruti is a writer that we're gonna like this. She's it. She's like incredible, and I'm just like blown away that I'm even in conversation with Shruti right now, because I think she's a phenomenal writer, just working at a completely different level than so many. I don't know. I just can't go on enough. I was hoping to really do this in person so I could like properly rave about Shruti's book and make everybody buy several copies. But I'm so in awe of Shruti's talents, and The Archer is incredible. There's so many things going on in that book. It's such a textured novel. So, sorry, just gonna say that.
Not at all. I co-sign all of the above. Totally agree. Thank you. And also, A House is a Body, as long as we're putting all of this out there. Really wonderful. I'm very grateful to you both. And I'll say good night. Thank you so much. Until next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.